By the time Vittorio Falcone got there, the restaurant was already gone. The demolition had been on the city's books for months, but not for that morning. Somebody had moved it up. 2 weeks early, 6 o'clock in the morning, no phone call to the owner. And the heavy machinery was already reducing the front half of the building to dust by the time his car pulled in. Men like him didn't get warned twice, and he knew a warning when he was standing in one. He stopped at the edge of the rubble with his coat open. And he didn't raise his voice. Because in 18 years he'd never needed to. 38 years old, head of the oldest family in Rhode Island, a man who'd settled 3 wars without ever once shouting in a room. His right hand stayed in his coat pocket, closed around a folded paper napkin that had come in the morning mail, 4 words on it, in handwriting he'd have known blind. Then his wife came tearing past him into the ruins, over the broken brick and the wrong shoes, straight to the back corner where the wine cellar used to be, pulling boards away with her bare hands. She didn't say a word to him, and she didn't look back once, and that was the thing he couldn't get past. She was clawing through the wreckage of a building she'd told him twice she'd never cared about. Something in his chest went cold and quiet. He crossed the rubble and took hold of her wrist. For the first time in 4 years, the calm went out of his voice. "What are you hiding under this restaurant?" She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. And behind her, where the cellar floor had caved in, there was a space that shouldn't have been there at all. Nobody standing in that lot knew it yet. Not his men, not the woman shaking in his grip, not the man who ran half of Rhode Island. But what was buried under that floor had been sitting there for 3 years, waiting for exactly this morning. And by the time the dust settled, Vittorio Falcone would be down on his knees in it. Stay with this story until the very end to understand why. Now let us go back to that winter night 3 years ago, when a dying man chose his son's wife over his own son. Salvatore Falcone didn't call his son. He called his daughter-in-law. It was 2 a.m. in February, in a room on the 3rd floor, and he was sitting propped against the headboard with both hands resting on the blanket like a man waiting for someone who was expected to arrive exactly on time. Downstairs came the voices of men, 7 or 8 of them, and among them was her husband. "Lock the door," he said. Emma locked it. "Vittorio is downstairs," she said. "I know he's downstairs. Do you want me to call him up?" "No." He didn't say the word forcefully, but she stopped in the middle of a step, because in this house, when Salvatore Falcone said no, no one asked a second time. He pointed toward the wardrobe in the corner of the room and told her to open it, down at the bottom, behind several pairs of shoes. Emma knelt, moved 2 pairs aside, and her fingers touched a cold metal corner. She had to use both hands to pull it out, an iron chest only slightly smaller than a carry-on suitcase but far heavier than its size suggested, with a layer of sealing wax hardened across the lid, stamped with a crest she had never seen anywhere else in the house. She set it on the floor beside the bed. "It's heavy," she said. "Don't open it." "I haven't." "I know. I'm telling you now so you won't have to think about doing it." He looked at the chest for a moment, then looked at her. "Listen to 3 things," he said. "If you can't promise me all 3, I'll put it back. You'll walk out of this room, and we'll pretend tonight never happened." "I'm listening." "First, you only open it when this family is truly about to fall. Not when things are difficult. Not when we've lost money. When we're about to have nothing left. How will I know when that time comes?" "You'll know. People always know. Most of them simply choose not to believe it." Emma rested her hand on the edge of the chest. The metal was still cold. "The second thing," she said, "you must never use it for yourself. Not one part of it. Not ever. Even if you have nothing left to eat." "I don't need anything, Papa." "I know. That's why I called you." He gave a short cough, then swallowed it back. "The third is the hardest one. You won't like it. Tell me. You must never let Vittorio know you're keeping it." Emma pulled her hand away from the chest. "You're asking me to hide something from my husband." "Yes." "For how long?" "Until the day you have no choice but to tell him. And if that day never comes, then you take it with you to the grave, and no one in this house ever knows it existed." He paused. "Not even him." She stood, walked 2 steps toward the window, then turned back. The voices downstairs had grown fewer. Someone had just opened the front door. "You don't trust him," she said. "Of course I trust him." He spoke more slowly now. "I trust that he'll die for the Falcone name. I trust that he'll never sell out a single person. Those are the 2 things I know about my son more certainly than anything else in this world." "Then why?" "Because he doesn't see." Salvatore tapped 2 fingers lightly against the side of the bed. "He can see this whole city, Emma. He knows who owes who money. He knows which cop can be bought and which one can't. But he can't see the people standing closest to him. He never learned how. And I'm the one who failed to teach him." Emma said nothing. "Someone in this house is selling us out," he said. "I don't know who." She turned and looked at him. You're serious. For 3 months I've been lying here counting. There are things only 4 people know, and somehow people outside still learn them. I've already crossed 3 names off the list. He lifted a hand and pointed toward the door. The 4th person walks these halls every day and claims to protect this family. Tell Vittorio. If I tell him, he'll go looking, and if he goes after the wrong man, we'll lose the very family I was supposed to leave him. Salvatore shook his head once. No, this chest will speak for me on the day it needs to speak. All you have to do is keep it. Emma looked down at the wax on the lid. Near one edge was a small crack where it had dried with age. You have 11 restaurants and 30 men out there ready to do anything you tell them, she said. Why me? Because you've been in my kitchen since you were 19 years old. She raised her eyes. 7 years ago, you stood at my prep station cutting onions 12 hours a day, and not once did you ask me to give you anything. I noticed that 3 years before you ever met my son, he continued without raising his voice. People like to think I chose you because you're his wife. I didn't. I chose you before he even knew who you were. You're making it hard for me to breathe when you say things like that. I only have a few more chances left to say what needs saying. So I'm going to say all of it. He reached out and laid his hand over the back of hers, and she felt how cold it was. I trust you more than I trust my own blood. Because you're the only person in this house who's never needed anything from me. Emma sat without moving for a very long time. Then she said, I promise all 3. Salvatore Falcone didn't thank her. He simply closed his eyes, and for the first time in 3 months, his breathing became even. She carried the chest out of the room beneath her coat, holding it against herself with both arms. At the foot of the stairs, Vittorio stood with 2 of his men, halfway through a sentence. He stopped. Is Papa awake? He is. Did he say anything? Emma tightened her grip on the coat. He asked what time it was. That was the first lie she ever told her husband, and for the next 4 years she would remember that night exactly. Not because of the promise, but because it was the last night she still had a choice. At 4 that morning, Emma parked behind Rosanera on Atwell's Avenue, unlocked the back door with her own key, and went straight down to the wine cellar. She didn't turn on the ceiling light. She used only the small flashlight from the tool drawer. In the farthest corner, where the wine rack stood tight against the wall, and no one ever had any reason to drag a chair, there was a patch of tile older than the rest of the floor. She pulled the wine rack away, took a hammer and crowbar, pried up 4 tiles, and began to dig. The earth underneath was hard-packed and mixed with bits of stone, so she dug with a hand trowel and with her bare hands, filling 2 paint buckets with dirt, carrying each one out to the car whenever it was full. 4 hours. A little after 8, the hole was finally deep enough. She lowered the iron chest inside, the wax seal still untouched, then took the half bag of cement left over from the plumbing repairs the year before, mixed it in an old bucket, and covered the opening. She set the 4 tiles back exactly where they had been, worked the edges until they matched, pushed the wine rack back into place, swept away every trace of dust, then washed her hands beneath the kitchen faucet 4 times until there wasn't a speck of lime left beneath her fingernails. At 9, the first employee arrived, and Emma was standing at the prep station slicing onions as she did every morning. Rosanera had been a wedding gift from her father-in-law, signed over into her name the very week she entered the Falcone family, and when he handed her the papers, he said only one thing: everyone in this family has something that belongs to them alone. This is yours. Don't ever let anyone tell you what to do in your own kitchen. She was the chef, and she spent 14 hours a day there. Vittorio ate at Rosanera once a week, always at table number 4, always with 2 of his men seated near the door, and he never brought business inside. That had been their agreement since the beginning of their marriage. She didn't ask what he did out there, and he didn't allow a single phone call to intrude on the 4 hours he spent in her restaurant. 3 weeks after the funeral, a man from Boston came to see Vittorio with an offer involving 3 warehouse docks south of the city, a profit larger than anything the family had made in 5 years. Vittorio listened to the entire proposal, didn't ask a single question, then said no. The man thought it was a bargaining tactic, so he raised the offer. Vittorio still said no. That evening, Emma asked him why, and he told her his father had promised the former owner of those docks that the Falcone family would never touch them. She asked if the man was still alive. Vittorio said he'd been dead for 4 years. She asked who was left to hold him to it. He didn't answer that question. He simply folded the newspaper, went upstairs, and that was the first time she understood clearly that her husband considered a promise made to a dead man heavier than money offered by a living one. She remembered that for a very long time, because at that moment she was still carrying a promise of her own that she wasn't allowed to tell him about. Vivian Ashford had come to Rosanera 3 years earlier asking for a serving job, carrying a resume that listed 10 years at a diner on the corner of Broadway, and nothing else. Emma hired her that same day. 3 months later, Vivian was the only person on the evening shift who knew how to calm a table of 8 angry customers, so Emma put her behind the counter. 6 months after that, Emma taught her how to read inventory sheets, how to calculate the food cost of every dish, how to say no to a supplier without losing them. Vivian learned so quickly that Emma had to teach faster just to stay ahead of her. By the second year, Emma signed the papers making Vivian manager and gave her the restaurant's second set of keys, something only one other person besides Emma had ever been allowed to hold. People often asked Emma why she trusted an outsider that much, and she always gave the same answer: because she had once watched Vivian stop to clean up a broken glass at the last table at 1 a.m, when there wasn't a single person left in the room to see her do it. Vivian never asked for a raise. She remembered the names of every regular customer, even the names of the vegetable deliveryman's 2 grandchildren. And whenever Emma mentioned something that needed doing, Vivian wrote it down in a small notebook she kept in her apron pocket. One winter, Emma came down with a bad case of the flu, and Vivian closed the restaurant at 2 a.m, then drove 20 minutes to Emma's house to bring her porridge. Emma had once told her husband, "There are 2 people in that kitchen I trust. One is me, and the other is Vivian." Vittorio listened and said, "Good." He ate there every week for 3 straight years, and every time water was poured at his table, Vivian was the one standing beside him. But in all those 3 years, he never once called her by name. 1 year after that night in the room on the 3rd floor, Emma's phone rang at 11:40 at night. Vivian's name was on the screen. "Emma, the pipe in the wine cellar burst. The water's already up to my ankles." Emma was sitting at the dining table in her house, a pen still in her hand. "Have you called a plumber?" "I did. They said the earliest they can get here is 7 in the morning. What about the wine?" "The bottom 2 racks are underwater." Emma stood up immediately. Vittorio was in Newport and wouldn't be home before 2 in the morning. She sent him a single message: "A pipe burst at the restaurant. I'm going over for a little while," then picked up her car keys. At 12:10, she parked behind the restaurant. Every light in the dining room was off. Only the kitchen lights were on. Vivian stood at the top of the stairs leading down to the cellar, holding a flashlight, her pants rolled up to her knees. "Be careful coming down, Emma. The 3rd step is slippery." Emma descended. There was no water. The floor was dry. "Where's the broken pipe?" she asked. Vivian didn't answer. Emma turned and looked up, and the cellar door closed. It didn't slam. It closed slowly, as if someone above had pushed it shut. She heard the bolt slide into place. Vivian. She was standing 3 steps away from Emma. The flashlight lowered so its beam fell across the floor between them. "Vivian, open the door. Just stay where you are." Emma climbed 2 steps and knocked on the door. "Who's up there?" No one answered. She called louder. Still nothing. Only the sound of a chair scraping across the wooden floor. Someone sitting down just outside the door. Emma came back down, and this time she looked directly at Vivian. "What do you want?" "Put your phone down on the table." Emma didn't. She opened it. No signal. She took 3 steps to the right. Still nothing. She looked toward the corner of the ceiling and saw a small gray box mounted there. Something that hadn't been there the week before. "What did you put up there?" Vivian didn't answer. At the top of the stairs, the door opened a few inches, and a man came down 3 steps before stopping. Emma had never seen him before. He looked about 40, both hands in the pockets of his coat. He didn't say anything. He simply stood there looking down at her. Vivian said his name once, Carl, and then fell silent. Emma backed toward the wine rack in the farthest corner, and she felt her feet settle directly over the 4 tiles. She didn't look down. She said, "Vivian, listen to me. I don't know what you want, but whatever it is, I'll give it to you right now." "Look at the time," Vivian said. Emma looked at the clock on the wall. 12:32. Outside, 18 miles away, on Route 6 where it passed through Foster, a car left the road and came to rest below the embankment. No one witnessed what happened during the first 7 minutes. Then a small truck drove past, slowed down, and the driver called 911. At 12:44, dispatch recorded the first call. At 12:48, 2 more calls came in. Down in the cellar, Emma heard a siren, distant, faint, carrying through the ventilation pipe in the wall. She lifted her head. Then came a second siren, a different kind, then a third. Vivian looked up too. And in that moment, Emma saw something she still wouldn't forget 2 years later. Vivian had been waiting for those exact sirens. "What did you do?" Emma said. "Sit down." "What did you do, Vivian?" "Sit down." Emma didn't sit. She looked around the cellar she had stood in thousands of times, the wine racks, the old paint bucket, the 2 slippery steps, and she understood that she had nothing. The phone in her hand had no signal. The door above her was bolted. The man named Carl was still standing on the 3rd step and hadn't spoken a single word. The sirens outside grew thicker, then more distant, until only one remained, stretching westward through the night. Vivian tapped her phone 3 times, read something on the screen, then slipped it into the pocket of her apron, the same pocket where for 3 years she had kept the little notebook in which she wrote down everything Emma asked her to remember. Then she said, "Emma, listen to me once. After tonight, don't ever say my name again." Emma took 1 step toward her. Carl came down 1 step. Emma stopped. The flashlight in Vivian's hand lowered all the way toward the floor, leaving the upper half of her body in darkness, and Emma could no longer see her face clearly. On the ceiling, a small light blinked once, then went out. Emma heard the bolt on the door move a 2nd time, and this time it was the lock. She looked at the clock on the wall one last time. 1:09 in the morning. Outside, at a bend on Route 6, a Rhode Island State Police trooper was writing down the license plate of a car registered to Emma Marchetti Falcone, 27 years old, with an address in Federal Hill, Providence. Emma woke in a room she had never known existed. It lay behind the wall at the far end of the wine cellar, where an old doorway had once been sealed off back when her father-in-law was still alive, and now there was a new iron door with a numeric keypad mounted outside. Inside was a single bed, a sink, 1 light bulb in the ceiling, and no windows. She had no idea how long she had been asleep. There was a needle mark on her wrist. She stood, became dizzy, sat back down, then tried again and managed 3 steps to the door. It didn't open at all. She knocked. No one answered. She kept knocking until her hand hurt, then sat on the floor and waited. There was no clock in the room, so she couldn't tell whether it was day or night outside. Eventually the door opened, and the person who entered wasn't Carl. The person wore a hat and a coat, and the entire face was wrapped in bandages from the hairline down to the jaw, leaving only 2 eyes, 2 nostrils, and a narrow opening for the mouth exposed. Emma recognized the shape of the body before she recognized the voice. Vivian placed a laptop on the bed, opened it, and played a news report that had already been downloaded. On the screen, a reporter stood on a dark stretch of road, with 3 fire trucks and a blue tarp behind him. They said her name, Emma Marchetti Falcone, 27 years old, owner of Rosa Nera on Atwells Avenue, pronounced dead at the scene. Then came another report from 3 days later, only 1 brief sentence this time, saying that identification had been completed through comparison with dental records. Emma stared at those words for a very long time. She was the only person in that room who knew she hadn't visited any dental office in the past 3 years, and that her dental films were kept in a file at a clinic 4 blocks from the restaurant. Someone had gone in there and replaced them 3 days after the fire, just before the medical examiner opened the file. The body in the car had been identified using the substituted records. Vivian closed the laptop. "Tomorrow morning, they'll transfer me to a private hospital in Warwick," she said, and her voice was raw now, no longer the voice of the woman who had poured water at table number 4 for 3 years. 4 months. My face stays completely bandaged. No visitors. Only my husband is allowed in. The doctor will write in my chart that smoke inhalation damaged my airway, permanently changing my voice, and that nerve damage caused partial memory loss. Emma understood immediately why Vivian had chosen to say those 3 things aloud. It wasn't to explain. It was to make Emma understand that every question Vittorio would ask over the next 2 years already had an answer waiting for him, and every one of those answers would exist inside a medical record signed by a doctor. She said, "He'll know." Vivian didn't answer that. She took out her phone and opened a photograph. Emma looked at it and needed a second to understand what she was seeing. It was her husband, standing on the steps of their home, a ring of keys in one hand, his head turned slightly to the right as though he were speaking to someone inside. The photograph had been taken from above, angled slightly downward, and from all 4 edges of the image, 4 thin lines crossed at the exact center of his chest. Vivian said, "About 1,300 feet, from the roof across the street." She swiped to the second photograph. The same steps, a different shirt, a different day. Then the third. Emma placed one hand on the edge of the bed and said nothing. Then Vivian swiped to another photograph, and this one was no longer Federal Hill. It showed a hallway with a handrail running along the wall, and an elderly woman sitting in a wheelchair beside a window, both hands resting in her lap as she looked outside. Emma recognized her mother. Teresa Marchetti had moved into that facility 14 months earlier. After the doctor said she could no longer live alone, and the monthly cost was more than Emma earned from the restaurant. Vivian said, "Starting next month, I'll pay for that place." Emma looked up. "With what?" "With your account," Vivian said. "You're dead, so the account passes to your husband, and your husband doesn't read every individual expense. If I stop paying, they'll put her out within 2 weeks." Emma sat perfectly still. She had stood in her own kitchen 14 hours a day for 7 years. She had spent 4 hours digging beneath her own floor, with no one beside her, and sealing the earth over with cement. And through all those years, she had always believed that if the day ever came when she had to choose, she would be able to choose. Now there was nothing to choose at all. She said, "If I leave this place, he dies. If I stay here, my mother ends up on the street." Vivian folded the phone closed and slipped it into her apron pocket. Then she spoke the last 3 sentences she would say before leaving the room. And Emma would remember every word exactly for the next 730 nights. "You don't speak. You don't write. You say one word, and he dies before you do." The iron door closed. Outside came 6 beeps from the keypad, then the heavy sound of a bolt sliding into place, and then nothing. Emma sat on the floor of a room hidden beneath her own restaurant, no more than 23 feet from where the iron chest lay buried, and she didn't make a sound. The rule was only 1 line, and Carl read it to her on the first morning. She wasn't allowed to speak to anyone. Not even to anyone in the kitchen. Not even to him. If anyone asked, she was to shake her head and point to her throat. 4 months later, after the woman whose face had been completely bandaged in Warwick was discharged and returned to the Falcone home, Vivian came down to the cellar and handed her a plastic box. Inside was a thin piece of flesh-colored silicone, about the length of a handspan, with adhesive on the back. Every morning before she climbed the stairs, she pressed it onto her left cheekbone, and it created the appearance of an old burn scar running from the outer corner of her eye down to her jaw. No one in the kitchen ever looked at it for more than 3 seconds. People looked once, then looked away, and by the next day they didn't look anymore. The name on the shift schedule was Nora. Vivian told everyone that Nora had survived a house fire in Pawtucket, had lost her voice because of smoke inhalation, and didn't have complete documentation, so she was working week to week. No one in Rosanera's kitchen asked another question, because in every kitchen in Providence there was at least one person people knew not to ask about. She worked in the back of the kitchen, near the sinks and the door leading out to the trash bins, and she almost never went onto the dining room floor. At 11 every night, Carl stood at the top of the stairs. She went down, and he entered 6 numbers. Emma could count the beeps, but she never managed to see which buttons his fingers touched. The first moment of those 2 years came during the 3rd week. She was scrubbing a baking tray when she heard her own laugh. Her exact laugh, the same rhythm, coming from the dining room beyond the wall. She set the tray down and stood perfectly still for a long time, both hands still covered in soap suds. The second moment came when she discovered the ventilation shaft. In the room beneath the cellar, close to the ceiling, there was a square metal vent she had always assumed opened somewhere outside onto the street. It didn't. The duct ran upward and opened at the bottom of the dividing wall in the dining room, right beside table number 4. One Tuesday night, she heard it clearly. So clearly it was as though someone were speaking directly into her ear, her husband's voice ordering dinner. He ordered exactly what he had ordered every week for 3 years. Then he thanked the server. Then he asked someone what time it was. Emma sat on the floor beneath that metal vent with both hands pressed tightly over her mouth, and she remained there until there was no one left upstairs. From that night on, every Tuesday, she sat down in that exact spot. The third moment wasn't about her husband. It happened one evening in October, when Carl locked the door later than usual, and as Emma went down the stairs, she saw a covered ceramic plate resting on the 5th step, still warm. Inez Alvarez, the dishwasher, 60 years old, had worked at Rosanera since Emma's father-in-law was still alive, spoke very little English, and rarely said more than 5 sentences to anyone in the kitchen in an entire day. She never asked Emma a single question. She didn't ask why Emma slept down there. She didn't ask about the scar on her cheek. She didn't ask who entered the numbers at the door. She simply left a hot meal on the 5th step every night before going home, and she did it 730 times, over 2 years, without missing a single evening. Above that floor, in the house on the hill in Federal Hill, Emma's husband was living with a woman he wouldn't allow himself to suspect. 3 months after his wife came home from the hospital, Vittorio noticed that she held a knife in her right hand. Emma was left-handed. He had watched her chop onions with her left hand for 7 years. But the doctor in Warwick had written 2 lines in her medical record about impaired movement on the left side after the accident. and Vittorio had read those 2 lines, so he said nothing. The second time happened at home, one evening when she was cooking, and he noticed there was no rosemary in the kitchen. He opened the cabinet. There wasn't any there either. He asked about it, and she said the smell had made her nauseated ever since the hospital. His wife had put rosemary into almost everything she cooked. Even dishes no one else would ever put it in. He looked at the open cabinet, closed it, and said nothing. The third time was the hardest. For 4 years, every night when the lights went out, Emma had always said the same thing. One short sentence in the Italian her mother used to speak, and Vittorio had always answered with the same sentence in return. One night, in the darkness, he said his line first, and nothing came back. He waited. Then she asked what he'd just said. He told her it was nothing. The next morning, he called the doctor in Warwick and asked about the missing memories. And for 15 minutes someone explained it to him using words he couldn't verify. He thanked them, hung up, and never mentioned it again. Beginning in the 2nd week after she came home, she asked to sleep in a separate room. She told him she couldn't bear having another person lying beside her in the dark, that she needed time, that she was asking him not to ask anything more. Vittorio Falcone said all right, and for 2 years he kept that promise exactly, never once crossing through that doorway. He was a man who, in 18 years, had never broken a promise to anyone. It was the most beautiful thing about him, and during those 2 years, it was also the thing that helped keep his wife imprisoned beneath the floor of her own restaurant. It began with a shipment at the Fields Point docks. 2 container trucks left the port at 4 in the morning and were stopped less than 2 miles away, at a place Vittorio's men had passed through for 4 straight years, without anyone asking a single question. 11 days later, a second shipment was seized in Woonsocket, at exactly the right time again, as though someone had written the schedule down on paper and handed it to the other side. Vittorio sat in his office listening as Tommy Ricci reported what had happened. And the first thing he asked wasn't how much they had lost. He asked who knew the schedule. Tommy said 4 people. Vittorio told him to read the names. Tommy read all 4, and Vittorio's own name was among them. 3 weeks later, one of the family's longest-serving capos was indicted in federal court in Providence, and the indictment contained passages describing conversations that only 4 people should have known about. Then the grand jury subpoenas began arriving. The first went to a trucking company registered under someone else's name, the second to one of the 11 restaurants, the third to the bank, and that was the one that made everyone in the house sit a little straighter, because a subpoena sent to the bank meant the other side was no longer searching blindly. They already knew which cabinet to open. In 8 weeks, the Falcone family lost more than it had lost in the previous 10 years combined. The Belandi family on the east side of the river had been waiting for something like this since Salvatore was still alive. They did nothing, and that was exactly what made it frightening. They simply waited, because in Vittorio's world, when a name began to crack, people didn't push. They stood back and watched until it broke on its own, then stepped in to gather what was left. Tommy said the Belandis had made reservations that week at 2 places where they had never booked a table before. Vittorio said he already knew. On the 3rd Sunday of the month, he went to church on Atwell's Avenue, just as he had every week since he was 7 years old. As soon as the car stopped, a woman around 44 approached, stood 2 steps from the door, and held up her badge low enough that no one behind her could see it. Tommy opened the door and stepped out, placing himself between them. Vittorio said it was all right and got out of the car. She said her name was Ruth Kessler, that she was a federal agent, and that she needed only 90 seconds. Mr. Falcone, I'm not here to offer you any kind of deal. Vittorio said. You don't think I'm on my way to Mass? She said. I chose this place because it's the only place all week where you don't have a lawyer walking beside you. He didn't answer. She continued. Those 2 shipments of yours weren't taken because we're good at our jobs. Last month's indictment wasn't either, and you're far too smart not to understand what that means. Vittorio looked at her and said nothing. Then Kessler said the sentence he would carry with him for the next 8 months. Someone inside your house is talking to us, and it isn't the person you think it is, he said. You came here just to tell me that, she said. I came here so that when everything falls apart, you'll remember someone warned you first. Then she stepped back and walked toward the end of the street. Tommy asked whether he should have someone follow her. Vittorio said no. He went inside the church, sat in the 4th pew as he did every week, and didn't hear a single word of the service that day. That afternoon, he called Curtis Vaughn to the house. Vaughn was 58 years old, and had been the family's lawyer since Vittorio was 11. He was the man who had taken Vittorio by the hand into that very church on Sundays, when his father was away. The man who had held him back at the funeral home, when Vittorio wanted to stand up and speak. Vittorio told him about the entire encounter, leaving out nothing. Vaughn listened to every word, set down his glass, then said she was doing exactly what people like her were trained to do, which was to approach you when I'm not there, throw out one sentence vague enough to send you home questioning every person around you. He said, if someone is talking to them, I'll find out who it is, but you have to let me do this my way. And until then, you can't show suspicion toward anyone in front of the others, because a family never collapses because of what's outside. It collapses when the people inside begin looking at one another. Vittorio asked what he needed. Vaughn said, I need access to every document, including everything that belonged to your father. Vittorio said, look at whatever you need. Vaughn asked whether anyone else knew about this. Vittorio said, only you and Tommy. Vaughn thanked him, put on his coat, and before walking out the door, he said something in the same voice Vittorio had been hearing since he was 7 years old. Your father entrusted you to me, and I've never let you face anything alone. I won't start now. Vittorio Falcone trusted him. Through all 8 of those months, that was the only thing he never doubted, not even for a second. The following Tuesday night, 2 servers called out within the same hour. No one in the kitchen thought anything of it. Vivian stood at the host stand, reviewed the table chart, then walked into the back of the kitchen and told Nora that she would be working the floor that night, 3 tables in the inner section. The head chef looked up and said that girl has never worked the floor before. Vivian said it's fine, only 3 tables. I'll be nearby. Then she handed Emma a black apron and an order pad. And among the 3 tables she assigned to Emma was table number 4. Emma took the pad and showed no reaction. Over the past 2 years, she had learned that a reaction was the most expensive thing she could afford to give. She smoothed the silicone piece against her cheek until the edges lay flat, tied back her hair, fastened the apron around her waist, and stepped onto the dining room floor of her own restaurant for the first time in 700 nights. Vittorio arrived at 7:10, alone, while his 2 men sat at the table near the door, as they did every week. He took off his coat, draped it over the back of his chair, and unfolded his napkin. Emma approached, standing slightly to his left, at exactly the distance she herself had taught her staff 7 years earlier, and set down his glass of water. He said thank you without looking up. She held out the order pad and pointed to her throat. He looked at the pad, then understood, and gave his order a little more slowly. Exactly the same thing he had ordered every week for 3 years. When she reached out to take back the menu, her fingers brushed the back of his hand. He stopped, half a second. He looked up, and his eyes rested on the burn scar along her left cheekbone, before dropping back to the folded newspaper on the table. Emma went downstairs to the kitchen. She stepped into the walk-in cooler, closed the door behind her, pulled a towel from the rack, pressed it over her face, and screamed into it. No sound escaped through the insulated door. It was cold in there, and she was alone. Then she straightened, hung the towel back on the rack, and walked out. His dish was finished and waiting at the pass. Emma walked past it, and she did what she had been planning from the moment Vivian handed her the order pad. She reached into the herb drawer, took out a sprig of rosemary, stripped the leaves with her fingers, crushed them once in her palm to release the oil, and scattered them over the dish. Not much. Exactly the amount she had used on that same dish for 3 years. Then she carried the plate to table number 4 and set it in front of him. Vittorio took the first bite. He stopped. He set down his knife, used his fork to gently move aside the top of the dish, then looked up and scanned the dining room. At that moment, 2 servers were moving through the inner section, and neither of them was the woman who had brought him his plate. He looked toward the host stand. Vivian was standing there with one hand resting on the reservation book, and she told him there was someone new in the kitchen. Let me check. He asked, where is the woman who just brought me my food? Vivian said she already went downstairs. Her shift ended at 8. Vittorio kept looking toward the kitchen entrance for another moment. Then he finished the entire plate, said nothing more, and when he stood to leave, he placed the tip beneath the edge of the plate, folded once, the way he always did. He told Vivian to pass along a message to her, and he said 3 words he couldn't remember ever saying to anyone before. Hang in there. Then he put on his coat and walked out the door. Down below, the iron door opened, and Vivian stepped inside. She stood in the middle of the room without turning on another light and said, I saw everything. Emma didn't respond. Vivian said, do you know what happens if he asks one more question? Emma still didn't answer. Vivian placed a sheet of paper on the edge of the bed. It was a printed email from the nursing facility, addressed to the person responsible for payment, stating that this month's fee had not been received, and that if payment wasn't made within 14 days, Teresa Marchetti would be transferred to the waiting list for a public facility north of the city, with an address and telephone number included. Vivian said, "I canceled the automatic transfer this morning." Emma picked up the paper and read it twice. Her hands were perfectly steady, because for the past 2 years her hands had always needed to be perfectly steady. Vivian said, "1 month. If nothing else happens for 1 month, I'll turn it back on." Then she left the room, and the door closed behind her. Emma sat on the floor, folded the paper into quarters, and pushed it into the narrow space between the mattress and the bed frame. Above her, in the dining room, people were stacking chairs on top of tables so they could clean the floor. She could hear every single chair. She had waited 2 years for her husband to stop for half a second, and he had stopped for half a second, and the price of that half second was her mother. That night, on the 5th step, there was still a covered plate of hot food waiting for her, just as there was every night, and Emma ate every bite because she understood that if she didn't eat, she wouldn't be able to stand the next morning. And if she couldn't stand, there would be no one left in this city who knew that Emma Falcone was still alive. That night, Vivian didn't go back to her room. She drove up to Federal Hill, entered the house through the side door, and stood at the foot of the stairs listening. Upstairs, she heard water running, then stopping. She went up and knocked twice. Vittorio opened the door. He was still wearing the shirt he'd had on that evening. He asked, "Do you need something?" She said, "I just wanted to see if you're all right." He said, "I'm fine. Go get some sleep. I have to be up early tomorrow." Then he told her good night, closed the door, and that was all. For 2 years, every exchange between them ended in exactly the same way. He never forgot to ask whether she had eaten. When she had a headache, he called a doctor to the house at 11 at night. He remembered how she took her coffee, remembered that she couldn't eat nuts, remembered which days she had appointments at the clinic. He was attentive to her in the kind of way any woman in Providence would have gone home and told her friends about, and he didn't touch her. Not once. She had asked to sleep in a separate room during the 2nd week after leaving the hospital, because at the time she needed the last of her surgical wounds to heal, and she had calculated that 6 months later she would tell him she was all right again. 6 months later, she did. He listened, then said, "There's no hurry. Take all the time you need." A year later, she said it again. He gave her the same answer. He kept his promise with the patience of a man who could wait 10 years for something. And little by little she understood that he wasn't waiting for her. He was keeping a promise to a woman he believed had died in that car on Route 6. And the woman sitting across from him at breakfast every morning was only the shell in which that promise had been placed. Vivian began sleeping 3 hours a night. She looked into mirrors longer than necessary. She stood in front of the bathroom mirror and studied the face she had paid a great deal of money to have, checking every detail, the line of the jaw, the bridge of the nose, the tiny mark beneath the right eye that Dr. Reese had redone twice. There was nothing wrong with it, and that was exactly the problem. Nothing was wrong with it, and still he wouldn't touch her. 10 years earlier, she had worked at a diner on the corner of Broadway, from 6 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon, and she had worked there for 10 years. She remembered which customer sat at which table, who didn't want ice, who left their tip in coins already counted out. People called her over by tapping 2 fingers on the tabletop, or by saying "miss," or by raising a hand without even looking in her direction. During those 10 years, there was one man who came in on Tuesdays, almost every week, always sat at the table in the corner, always drank his coffee without sugar, and always said thank you. She knew who he was. Everyone in the neighborhood knew who he was. She poured coffee for him more than 40 times in 1 year, and she could repeat word for word every sentence he had ever said to her during those 40 visits, because all 40 of them together amounted to no more than 20 words. Then the diner changed owners and closed. She went looking for work all over the neighborhood, and the woman at Rosanera read her 10-year resume in half a minute and hired her that same day. Emma Falcone was the first person in Vivian's life who ever asked her what she wanted to learn. Emma gave her the restaurant's second set of keys. Emma called her by name every day, many times a day, in front of the entire kitchen. And every Tuesday night, that same man came back and sat at table number 4, and Vivian stood beside him pouring his water for another 3 years, and all those 3 years together amounted to no more than those first 40 visits had. Other people looked at Emma Falcone and saw a kind woman. Vivian looked at Emma Falcone and saw a woman who possessed everything that a lifetime of honest work couldn't buy, and she saw that the distance between the two of them wasn't skill, wasn't hours worked, but something she had no way to cross through labor alone, so she crossed it another way. Beginning in the 13th month, she started practicing again. She locked her bedroom door, opened an old recording on her computer, a clip of Emma speaking during a promotional video for the restaurant, and repeated the words after her. She practiced lowering her voice at the ends of sentences. She practiced the laugh too. Her own voice had changed permanently, so she could never sound exactly like Emma. And still she practiced. 30 minutes, almost every night, in a locked room inside the most beautiful house on Federal Hill. The night she saw the rosemary on Vittorio's plate, she went home and practiced for 40 straight minutes. Then she turned off the recording, sat motionless for a very long time, and understood something she hadn't allowed herself to think about for 2 years. The woman beneath that floor didn't need to say a single word to take everything back. She only needed to be seen. Curtis Vaughn didn't want Vittorio's chair. He had been sitting in the Falcone family's office for 27 years, and he knew exactly what that chair was worth, which was nothing at all, because sooner or later the man who sat in it ended up in court. What Vaughn wanted was everything else. 11 restaurants along Federal Hill and in Cranston, 6 rental buildings downtown, 3 warehouse docks south of the city. Every one of them paid its taxes in full. Every one of them kept books that could survive an audit, and not one of them contained a single word connected to what the grand jury was looking for. Salvatore had spent the final 20 years of his life cleaning each asset one by one, and by the time he died, the clean side was 4 times larger than the dirty one. Vaughn had drafted most of the paperwork that made it possible. He knew every line. There was only one thing he didn't know, until the night he was given access to all the documents, including Vittorio's father's files, exactly as he had requested. The entire clean estate had been placed into a trust. Salvatore created 4 years before his death, and Vittorio wasn't the person who controlled it. The only person with control was Emma. Vaughn read that clause 3 times, then read it a 4th. He called a lawyer in Boston, gave no names, simply read the clause aloud, and the other man told him there was no way around it, because it wasn't a provision about signatures. The trust required the beneficiary to appear in person at the Providence headquarters of the bank, administering the trust, present identification, and provide a fingerprint to be compared against the sample taken on the day the trust was established. There were no exceptions for illness, partial memory loss, or recent hospitalization, and there was no way for anyone else to sign in her place. Vaughn sat motionless in that room for a long time, and then he understood why Vittorio Falcone's wife had always found a reason not to go to the bank during the past 2 years. She hadn't attended the insurance renewal signing in September. She hadn't gone to the notarization of the house documents, and the man who signed on her behalf that day had been Vaughn himself. She hadn't even attended the meeting he personally chaired in April, the meeting where everyone sat waiting for her for 40 minutes before word came back that she had a headache. The following Friday morning, Vaughn arranged to meet her in a private room behind a cafe in Cranston, a place no one from the family ever visited. He placed a copy of the clause on the table, pushed it toward her, and didn't say hello. He said, "Read the highlighted section." Vivian read the entire passage and set the paper down. He said, "I need you at the bank next Tuesday." She said, "I can't." He asked why not. She said, "Because I can't go." Vaughn sat straighter, and he said the sentence Vivian would later remember like the sound of a door closing. "You're his wife. You're Emma Falcone, so why can't you sign?" Vivian didn't answer. Vaughn looked at her for a long time, and in 27 years of practicing law, he had learned that people didn't stay silent because they didn't know the answer. They stayed silent because the answer was more dangerous than the question. He said, "I know that accident wasn't an accident." Vivian still didn't answer. He said, "I know because I was the one who ordered it." Outside the door came the sound of the coffee machine and someone laughing. Vaughn continued slowly, in the same voice he had always used when reading a will to a family. 2 years ago, when I discovered that trust existed, I told someone to take care of her. I paid once, and I didn't ask another question. 3 days later, I saw the news. I saw the blue tarp on the embankment. I saw the line saying the identification had been completed, and I believed it was over. He rested both hands on the table. Then 2 months later, you came out of the hospital with that face, and I sat in the funeral home beside the boy I had taken to Mass since he was 7 years old, and I told myself I had just been luckier than I deserved. Now you're sitting here unable to sign a name you've been using for 2 years. Vivian placed both hands flat on the table. Vaughn asked, "She's alive, isn't she?" Vivian didn't say yes. She didn't say no. She only looked at him, and that look was enough for him to know. Vaughn leaned back, and in that moment, the two of them understood exactly where the other stood. He had in his hands a woman who had stolen the identity of the boss's wife. She had in hers the only man who had ordered the killing of a member of the Falcone family. Neither of them could expose the other without hanging themselves with the same rope. They didn't shake hands, and they made no agreement. Vaughn simply folded the paper, slipped it into his briefcase, then stood and said one thing before walking out of the room. I don't need to know where you're keeping her, but next Tuesday, I need a signature, and I don't care whose hand writes it. Vaughn called again on Sunday night, and he made one thing clear. There was no possibility of having someone practice until they could imitate the signature. The bank had kept a specimen from the day the trust was created, and for large transactions they didn't compare signatures by eye. They sent them to a verification department, so a forgery would be detected the first time, and after that, the entire file would be frozen. He said, I need that exact hand to write it. Vivian asked, what about the fingerprint? Vaughn said, one step at a time. The signature first. I'll deal with the rest afterward. At 9 on Monday night, Vivian went down to the cellar carrying a thick document case and a pen. She set the case on the bed, opened it, and said, sign everywhere I've marked. Emma didn't take the pen. She pulled the papers toward herself and began to read. Vivian said, you don't need to read them. Emma kept reading. She had spent many evenings sitting in her father-in-law's office, listening to him explain how one restaurant could support 3 others, and for 7 years she had personally signed leases, supplier contracts, and insurance documents. She read slowly, and she read every word. 11 restaurants, 6 buildings downtown, 3 warehouse docks to the south. They weren't being sold all at once. They were being divided, piece by piece, among 3 different legal entities, each one purchasing a separate portion, at prices below market value, but not low enough to make anyone ask questions. On page 9, there was a line naming a real estate development company she had never heard of, and on page 12 was the name of the person signing on behalf of the receiving party, and that name was Curtis Vaughn. Emma sat for a very long time with the documents resting across her lap. She thought about that winter night 3 years earlier, about the cold hand resting over the back of hers, about Salvatore telling her that someone inside this house was selling us out. Now she was holding that very betrayal in her hands, written down in words, numbered by page, with spaces already waiting for her signature. She thought about the first condition among the 3 promises she had made, not when things are difficult, not when money is lost, when there is about to be nothing left. She understood that if these documents passed through the bank, then within 6 months the Falcone name would be nothing more than a name printed in an indictment, and the iron chest beneath the floor 7 yards from where she sat would have nothing left to save. Then she thought about the fact that she was locked behind an iron door with a numeric keypad, forbidden to speak, forbidden to write, while her mother lay in a facility whose bill was being paid by the woman standing in front of her. Emma had exactly one thing. She had her own hand, and they needed that exact hand. Emma picked up the pen. Vivian pushed the documents toward the first marked space. Emma signed. In 7 years as an owner, she had signed the name Emma Marchetti Falcone thousands of times, and her signature always began with a large looping stroke in the E, followed by Marchetti written in one continuous motion, with the cross on the second T extending backward almost the length of the entire word, a habit she had carried since she was 17. This time, she wrote the E exactly as she always had. She wrote Marchetti exactly as she always had, and when she came to that cross stroke, she stopped the pen early, shortening it to only 1/3 of its usual length, then lifted her hand. The difference was so small that on the page it was almost impossible to see. She turned the page and signed the second time in exactly the same way, then the third, then all 11 places. She did it with an absolutely steady hand, neither faster nor slower than usual, and for more than 20 minutes she didn't look up once. Vivian stood 2 steps away, watching from above. She saw the first stroke, saw the name Marchetti, and had no reason to look more closely, because she had seen that signature on timesheets, on delivery forms, on the document that had made her manager 3 years earlier, and it looked exactly the same. When Emma finished the final signature, she closed the papers and pushed them toward Vivian. Vivian asked, "You really signed them, didn't you?" Emma looked at her for a moment, then nodded. Vivian picked up the document case and walked toward the door. Before entering the code, she turned back and said, "I'll restart the nursing home payments tomorrow morning." Emma didn't respond. The iron door closed, followed by 6 beeps, then the sound of the bolt sliding into place. Emma remained seated on the floor, both hands resting palms down on her knees, and she looked at them for a long time. For 2 years, she hadn't been able to speak a single word, hadn't been able to write a single line, hadn't been able to send a single signal beyond those 4 walls. Tonight, she had just sent 11. They were lying inside a leather case, being carried by a 58-year-old man to a bank in Providence. And she didn't know who would open them, didn't know when, didn't know whether anyone would look closely enough. She only knew that for the first time in 730 nights, something of hers was leaving that cellar in her place. The person who called Vittorio was an assistant branch manager, a man his father had known for 20 years. He kept it brief, saying that a major set of transfer documents had been submitted on Tuesday. The verification department had flagged an irregularity in the signatures, and under bank policy, the documents were being placed on hold until the beneficiary appeared in person. Vittorio asked who had submitted them. The man said, "Your family lawyer." Vittorio thanked him, hung up, sat motionless for 2 minutes, then called Tommy Ricci. He didn't tell Tommy about the phone call. He gave him only 3 jobs. First, find out exactly what the bank had seen. Second, get the statements from his wife's private account for the 3 months before the accident. Third, reopen the Route 6 fire investigation from the beginning. Tommy asked who he wanted to know about it. Vittorio said no one. 4 days later, Tommy entered the office close to 11 at night, closed the door behind him, and didn't sit down. He gave 3 statements, one for each assignment, the same way he had delivered reports for 15 years. First, the bank said the signatures matched almost perfectly, but one finishing stroke was shorter than the specimen on file, exactly the same way in all 11 places, and when the same stroke appeared 11 times, they didn't consider it a trembling hand. Second, 3 weeks before the accident, $41,000 had been transferred from his wife's private account to a private surgical clinic in Warwick, and there had never been a similar payment before. Third, the doctor whose name was registered to that clinic was Alan Reese, 55 years old, who had left Rhode Island 14 months earlier and was now living in Naples, Florida, with his medical license revoked. Vittorio didn't ask a single question. He said, "What about the fire file?" Tommy placed a stack of photocopied papers on the desk. He said, "I had to go through 3 people to get this." Vittorio opened it. Inside was a copy of the identification report, attached to an access history log from the dental office where his wife had been treated, something no one had ever thought to compare because the identification had already been considered settled. The date the original dental films were taken, 3 years earlier. The date those films entered the medical examiner's file, 3 days after the fire, and between those 2 dates, one line stating that the file had been removed and returned during the same afternoon by an employee who had supposedly left the practice that spring. Vittorio read that line, then read it again, and said nothing. After a while, Tommy asked, "Should I go to Florida?" Vittorio said not yet. Tommy asked, "Then what do I do?" Vittorio said, "Go home and sleep. Tomorrow you drive me like you do every day, and you don't change a single thing about the way you greet her in the morning." Tommy Ricci had followed this man for 15 years. He understood immediately what that sentence meant. He nodded and didn't ask another word. Before leaving, he only said, "If you need me outside the hall tonight, I'll stay." Vittorio said thank you. "Go home." Then the door closed, and Vittorio Falcone sat alone in that room until morning. He didn't drink. He didn't call anyone. He didn't open the file again, because he had already memorized everything in it. He sat there and arranged each piece in the proper order, the way he always did whenever a shipment was seized or one of his men lied to him. A payment to a doctor 3 weeks before an accident. A set of dental films removed and returned during the exact week someone needed them. A woman who, for 2 years, had never once set foot anywhere that required identity verification. A hand holding a knife on the wrong side. A kitchen cabinet with no rosemary. A sentence spoken in the dark that received no answer. He had held every one of those pieces in his hands for 2 years, and every time, he had given himself a reason to put it back down, because the doctor had written it in the medical record, because she had survived something terrible, because suspecting the wife who had barely survived was something he could never forgive himself for. Now they lay beside one another on the desk, and there were no reasons left. The woman sleeping in the room at the far end of the hallway, less than 50 feet from where he sat, wasn't his wife. That was everything he knew that night. He didn't know where his wife was. He only knew that the body in the car on Route 6 had been given her name, and that 2 years earlier he had stood before that coffin and placed his hand on the wooden lid. At around 5 in the morning, Tommy stopped by and saw that the office light was still on. He didn't go inside. Years later, when someone asked him about that night, Tommy Ricci said only one thing, that he had stood outside that door for 15 minutes, and in 15 years of following the boss, he had never heard a silence like that. The notice from the city arrived on Thursday, sent by certified mail to every property owner along the final stretch of Atwells Avenue. The neighborhood redevelopment project had been approved by the council the previous fall, and the entire row of 7 buildings had been designated for acquisition, with compensation based on appraised value. Among the 7 names on the list was Rosa Nera. Vittorio read the letter over breakfast, folded it, and set it beside his coffee cup. He told his wife that the place was old anyway, and the compensation would be enough to reopen in a better location, 4 blocks away. She said no. He looked up. Over the next 2 weeks, Vivian hired 3 law firms. The first filed a procedural appeal. The second filed a petition demanding a new assessment of the building's historical value. The third she hired from Boston, at a fee Vittorio saw on the statement, and had to read twice. She attended 2 neighborhood council meetings, stood up and spoke at both, and both times she was denied. She called the city councilman's office 6 times in 1 week. One night, Vittorio passed her room at 3 a.m. and saw light still showing beneath the door. One evening, he knocked on the door to her study, sat across from her, and asked in the most ordinary voice he could manage, "Why are you fighting so hard to keep that place?" Vivian didn't look up from the papers. She said, "Because it's mine." Vittorio looked at her for a long time. The woman he had married had once sat in that exact chair, during the week when the family had nearly lost 2 warehouse docks, and she had told him that if they needed to, they could sell Rosa Nera because she still had 2 hands and could open somewhere else. He remembered the sentence exactly because that day he had told her never to say such a thing again. He didn't answer Vivian. He only said, "All right, get some rest tonight," then stood and left the room. That night, he called Tommy and told him to have someone go back through every document connected to Rosa Nera from the day ownership had been transferred. 3 days later, the demolition schedule was moved forward by 2 weeks. There was no new notice, no procedural violation, only one changed date on the construction schedule of the primary contractor. That contractor had received the work through a general contractor in East Providence, and the man behind that company was Belandi's brother-in-law. In Vittorio's world, something like that didn't require a phone call. All anyone had to do was move one date forward by 2 weeks on a perfectly legal project. No one broke the law. No one laid a hand on anyone. And the entire city would understand that the Falcone family could no longer protect even the restaurant that belonged to the boss's wife. Curtis Vaughn learned about the change date 2 days before Vittorio did. He didn't tell him. He sat in his office, recalculated his timetable, and decided that having the property cleared 2 weeks earlier actually worked in his favor, because the next grand jury subpoena would take effect in the middle of the following month, and he needed everything connected to that trust cleaned up before then. He called only Carl Soa. He asked whether there was anything at the site that needed to be dealt with first. Carl was the kind of man more loyal to money than to the person paying it, and he answered a little too quickly. "Don't worry. I've got the place under the cellar locked tight. No one goes in or out except me." Vaughn was silent for 3 seconds. Then he asked, "Who goes in and out?" Carl didn't answer. Those 3 seconds were enough. The following afternoon, Vaughn met Carl in a parking lot beside the highway. He didn't ask another question about the person beneath the cellar, because he already knew enough, and in 27 years of practicing law, he had learned that knowing more details only increased the amount he might someday have to testify about. He said only one thing, and he said it very clearly. The machines move in Tuesday morning. Before the first bucket touches that building, the cellar has to be empty. Carl asked, "What do you mean by empty?" Vaughn said, "You know exactly what I mean." Carl asked, "What about Miss Ashford?" Vaughn said, "She doesn't need to know, and you don't need to ask her, because from now until Tuesday morning, I'm the one paying you." He handed over an envelope, got into his car, and left. On Sunday night, in 3 different places across the city, 3 people couldn't sleep. In the house on the hill in Federal Hill, Vivian sat in front of her computer with a 4th appeal she already knew would be denied, and for 4 days she hadn't been able to think of any way to move a person out of that cellar without someone seeing. In an apartment on the south side of the city, Carl Soa sat counting the money in the envelope again and checking the time on his phone, and beneath the floor of Rosa Nera, inside the room with no windows, Emma Falcone heard the sound of a heavy engine stopping outside, then metal being lowered onto the street, then men calling out to one another. She stood and moved close to the wall. She pressed her ear against the concrete and listened. That night, 2 different things were counting down toward her at the same time, and she knew about only one of them. 3 weeks before that Sunday night, Emma did something she had spent 4 days preparing for. She stole a ballpoint pen from the order desk, hid it inside her mattress, and waited for exactly the right moment. On Friday afternoon, after the entire afternoon shift had come in, and only 2 people remained in the back of the kitchen, she stood at the sink beside Ines Alvarez. She took a napkin from the stack on the shelf, laid it on the stainless steel counter, and wrote. She wrote very quickly, Only 4 words, then folded the napkin into quarters. Ines saw her and said nothing. Emma held the folded paper in her palm, turned toward the older woman, and moved her lips. No sound came out. She mouthed an address, 1 word at a time, very slowly, and she did it twice. Ines Alvarez was 60 years old. She had come to America when she was 24, and in 36 years in Providence, she had learned enough English to work, and not enough to read a handwritten street name. She watched the other woman's mouth and caught only what she could. A number, a word that sounded something like Atwell's, and a proper name she didn't understand. She didn't ask anything. She didn't ask why. She simply looked into the eyes of the woman standing in front of her. And she had lived long enough to know what that look meant, even if she didn't know a single word of the story behind it. She held out her hand. Emma placed the paper in her palm. That evening, Ines went home, sat at her kitchen table, and unfolded the napkin. She could read 3 of the words, and she could read the 4th without understanding what it meant. She didn't unfold it any farther, didn't ask her daughter, didn't ask anyone. She took an envelope from the drawer, the kind she always used when sending money to her sister, put the napkin inside, sealed it, then tried to remember the mouth she had watched moving that afternoon, and wrote down what she could recall. She misspelled the street name by 1 letter, but she got the house number right. On Sunday morning, she walked to the mailbox on the corner, put a stamp on the envelope, and dropped it inside. Then she went home and told no one about it. Not in the 5 days that followed, not in the 3 weeks that followed, because in her life, helping someone without asking questions was so ordinary that it wasn't worth mentioning. Because the street name had been misspelled, the envelope wandered for 9 days. It reached a Falcone family restaurant in Cranston, where the manager dropped it into the general mail basket, and it sat there for 11 days beside electric bills, advertisements, and insurance notices, until Tuesday morning, when the entire stack of mail was gathered up and sent to the house on the hill in Federal Hill. On Sunday night, beneath the restaurant floor, Emma still had her ear pressed against the wall. Outside, workers were putting up construction fencing and lowering steel plates onto the street. Heavy engines roared to life, idled, shut off, then started again. She could even hear hammers striking each fence post into place. And as she stood there, she realized something she hadn't been able to use for 3 years. For 2 years, there had always been people above her. For 2 years, any scraping beneath the floor would travel up into the dining room, through the very ventilation shaft she sat beneath every Tuesday night. Tonight was different. Tonight, outside those walls, there was something louder than anything inside the building. Emma turned around, dragged the bed aside, and began to scrape. She scraped with the edge of the metal bowl, with the handle of a spoon, and with a piece of tile she managed to break loose from the edge of the wall. The cement she had mixed herself 3 years earlier was harder than she remembered. She worked for 2 hours. Every time the noise outside stopped, she stopped. Every time the machinery started again, she went back to scraping. At around 2 in the morning, the 4 tiles finally came loose. She clawed the earth away with both hands, and when her fingers touched that cold metal corner, she collapsed onto the floor and stayed there for a long time. The chest was heavier than she remembered. The wax seal was still there, cracked into 3 pieces but untouched by anyone. She broke it and lifted the lid. On top was a thick set of original trust documents bearing the bank's seal, far thicker than the version Vaughn had brought down for her to sign. Beneath them was an old external hard drive, with its cable wrapped around it, sealed inside 2 layers of plastic bags. And at the bottom was a sealed envelope, the front written in her father-in-law's handwriting, unread by anyone for 3 years, with only one instruction: give this to Vittorio when you have no choice but to tell him. Emma sat on the floor with the chest in her lap until morning. She didn't open the envelope. She had made 3 promises, and for 3 years she had kept every one of them, even the hardest. Now the first condition had finally come, and she was sitting in a place with no way out. If she remained in that room the next morning, the chest would be buried beneath the rubble with her. If she walked out and spoke a single word, then somewhere on a rooftop in Federal Hill, someone would be waiting for exactly that word. She remained there until the first human voice of that morning sounded outside. When the heavy bucket of the excavator struck the foundation wall above, the violent shock cracked the old concrete frame around the steel door, popping the deadbolt loose. Clutching the iron chest to her ribs, Emma threw her weight against the damaged door, squeezed through the widening gap into the collapsing wine cellar, and began her climb through the falling dust and shattered brick. Vivian opened her mouth, and no words came out. Vittorio was still holding her wrist. He didn't tighten his grip. He simply didn't let go, and he waited. She looked toward the far corner of the rubble, where the wine cellar floor had collapsed, then looked back at him, then looked toward that same place again. That was the fullest answer she was capable of giving him that morning. In the gap between broken planks and slabs of shattered concrete, something moved. A hand gripped the edge of a brick. Then an entire arm appeared. 2 of Vittorio's men stepped forward, and he raised one hand behind him, signaling them to stay where they were. The woman climbed up slowly because she was holding something heavy against her chest and had only one hand left to pull herself upward. She reached ground level, dropped to one knee, then straightened to her feet. She was wearing a black server's uniform, now coated gray-white from shoulder to hem. Her hair was matted with dust. Both arms were wrapped around an iron chest pressed against her chest. On her left cheekbone, the silicone piece had peeled halfway loose, lifting from the outer corner of her eye and hanging from the edge of her jaw. There was no burn scar beneath it. Beneath it was simply a face. No one on that property said a word. The construction foreman standing beside the cab of the trailer shut off the engine without anyone telling him to. 2 workers nearby took off their hats. Tommy Ricci, who had followed Vittorio Falcone for 15 years, let his hand fall away from the car door and stood perfectly still. Vittorio released Vivian's wrist. She stepped back once, then twice, then both her knees gave way against the broken brick, and she sank onto the ground. She didn't cry out. She didn't cover her face. She only sat there. Emma Falcone stood 6 paces from her husband. For 730 nights, she had rebuilt this moment in her mind more times than she could count, and she had prepared so many things she wanted to say. None of them came out. What came out was something she had never planned to say at all. 4 years earlier, in a small room behind the church on Atwells Avenue, this man had made 3 promises to her, and his second promise had been a sentence, he added himself, something that belonged to no ceremony. Emma opened her mouth. Her voice came out raw and broke in the middle of the sentence, because it hadn't been used for 2 years. You said you'd never make me wait for you. Vittorio Falcone didn't move. Then she said the second sentence. I waited 2 years. A car door closed somewhere behind them. Carl Soa came around the front of the small truck parked at the edge of the street, his right hand inside his coat, his eyes fixed on the woman holding the chest. He managed only 3 steps. Tommy was already there. He didn't shout. He locked Carl's wrist, turned him, forced him down against the hood, and pulled the gun from inside his coat. All of it, in about 4 seconds. No shot was fired. 2 of Vittorio's men dragged Carl behind the vehicle. Tommy slipped the gun into his own coat pocket, turned back, and said only one thing to his boss. This place isn't safe. Vittorio didn't turn around. He stepped forward. He walked across the rubble, past Vivian where she sat without looking down at her, and stopped 1 step away from his wife. He didn't reach for her. He didn't touch her. 2 years earlier, he had placed his hand on the lid of a coffin bearing her name, and now he stood in front of her and didn't dare touch her, because in 18 years, nothing had frightened him as much as the possibility that he might reach out and discover that this wasn't real. He slipped his right hand into his coat pocket. He took out the napkin, folded into quarters, the one he had carried in his pocket since 7 that morning, the one that had just been pulled from a stack of mail collected from a restaurant in Cranston, after wandering for 9 days because 1 letter in the street name had been written wrong. He unfolded it and held it up. 4 words, written quickly in ballpoint pen on a paper napkin, in handwriting he had recognized before he finished reading. I'm still right here. Emma looked at the napkin. She had written those words 3 weeks earlier at the sink in the back of the kitchen, and for all 3 of those weeks she hadn't allowed herself to believe they would ever reach anyone. She hadn't cried in 2 years. She didn't cry the night they showed her the news report. She didn't cry when she saw the photograph of her mother. That night, in the walk-in cooler, she had screamed into a towel, but she hadn't cried then either. Now her knees began to shake, and she could no longer hold the chest. Vittorio caught it with both hands before it struck the ground. He set it down on the broken brick at their feet. Then he straightened, and this time he reached out. Emma stepped into him and cried, standing on the ruins of her own restaurant, surrounded by more than a dozen men who didn't dare breathe too loudly. Vittorio Falcone held his wife with one arm, while his other hand pressed firmly against the back of her neck, and he didn't say a single word, because there were no words in existence for this. Behind them, sitting on the broken brick, Vivian Ashford watched the 2 of them, and she understood that the thing she had feared for 2 years had finally happened, and it had happened without the other woman needing to say a single word at all. They reached the house on the hill in Federal Hill close to noon. Emma showered, changed her clothes, and when she came downstairs, the iron chest had already been placed on the desk in the study, with Vittorio sitting across from it. She sat in the chair on the other side. She told him everything, from the beginning. She told him about the call at 11:40 that night, about the pipe that had never burst, about the cellar door closing behind her. She told him about the windowless room, about the silicone piece she pressed onto her face every morning, about the name Nora on the shift schedule. She told him about the 2 photographs they had shown her on the first night. She told him about the notice from the nursing home. She told him about Inez Alvarez and the hot plate left on the 5th step. She told him about the 11 signatures and the stroke she had deliberately shortened. Vittorio listened to all of it. He didn't interrupt her once. When she finished, he remained still for a long time, then stood, walked to the window, and stayed there with his back to her. He asked her one question in a voice she had never heard from him in 7 years. 2 years. You were down there, listening to my voice, and you didn't say a word. Emma didn't stand. She said, every time I thought about speaking, they showed me photographs of you taken through a scope, about 1,300 feet away, from the roof across the street. Then she continued without raising her voice. What did you want me to choose? Vittorio placed both hands on the windowsill. He didn't turn around. He knew very well that the anger burning inside his chest wasn't meant for her, that it belonged to a man who had sat eating at table number 4 every week for 2 years, while his wife sat beneath that floor, and that man was himself. But the anger slipped out anyway, and it slipped toward the one person in the room who least deserved to receive it. After a while, he said, I'm sorry. Emma said, I don't need you to apologize. Then she pushed the chest toward him. She took out the envelope and placed it on the desk with the handwriting facing upward. Vittorio turned and looked at it, and he recognized that handwriting immediately. He sat down, picked it up, and it took him a moment before he could bring himself to open it. The letter was handwritten on both sides. Salvatore Falcone had written it 3 years earlier. On the same winter night, he called his daughter-in-law upstairs. He wrote that someone inside the house was selling out the family, that he had counted and crossed 3 people off the list, that he hadn't told his son because, if he did, the boy would go looking, and if he went after the wrong man, everything would be lost. He wrote that the hard drive inside the chest contained everything he had gathered during his final 3 months. He wrote that if Vittorio was reading those words, then it meant the thing he had feared had already happened. And on the final line, he wrote one sentence Vittorio read 3 times in a row. You can see the whole city, Vittorio, but you've never been able to see the person standing beside you. Vittorio set the letter down. He said nothing for a very long time. Then he said, for 3 years, I thought my father died before he had the chance to leave me anything. Emma said, he did leave something. He left it with me. Vittorio asked, why you? Emma said, because I was the only person in this house who had never needed anything from him. Vittorio looked down at the desk. Then Emma continued, and she told him the part she could have kept silent about for the rest of her life, without anyone ever knowing. She said, this morning, when I climbed out from under there, I had already decided I might not give you this envelope. He looked up. She said, I thought about letting you go on believing that your father didn't trust you, that he hid everything from you and died without saying one last thing to you. I thought about burning it, and I thought about Vivian, about what her life would be like if I never said anything, if I simply stood there and let her wake up every day wondering whether today would be the day I opened my mouth. 1 year, 2 years, 5 years. I thought about that very carefully, Vittorio. I thought about it the entire way up. Vittorio asked, and then what? Emma said, then I remembered that I made a promise. She said, your father made me promise 3 things, and for 3 years I kept all 3, even the one that forced me to lie to you at the foot of the stairs that night. I didn't keep them because anyone was watching. No one was watching at all. A person only remains who they are when they keep their word at the moment no one can check. If I had burned this envelope this morning, I still would have walked out of that cellar. But the person who came out wouldn't have been the same person who went down. She pushed the envelope a little farther toward him. She said, this belongs to you. It always belonged to you. I was only keeping it safe. Vittorio Falcone sat in that room with his father's letter in his hands, and the wife he had buried 2 years earlier, sitting across a desk from him. He didn't stand. He didn't walk around to the other side. He only said one thing, very softly. I ate there every week. Emma said, I know. I was sitting right underneath you. Then neither of them said anything else, and no one in that room smiled. Curtis Vaughn didn't wait for anyone to come looking for him. By noon that day, he had heard what happened at the construction site, and before 4 in the afternoon he did 3 things. First, he filed a petition with the court, asking that Emma Marchetti Falcone be declared legally dead, attaching the identification report from 2 years earlier and the death certificate, clearing the way for the trust to be dissolved. Second, he sent a letter to the bank, stating that the beneficiary no longer existed. Third, He called the federal office and requested a meeting for Thursday morning, and he intended to bring enough with him to put Vittorio Falcone in prison for 15 years. Vittorio knew about all three before nightfall, because Vaughn had grown accustomed to always being the man who knew things first, and he had forgotten that the clerk at the county courthouse was the son of a man who once worked in Salvatore's kitchen. The meeting took place Wednesday night, in the private dining room, at the back of a restaurant in Cranston, one of the 11. Vaughn arrived exactly on time, because he was always on time. Vittorio was in the room, Tommy stood at the door, and Emma sat at the corner of the table. Vaughn saw her and stopped half a step short. Then he sat down and began to speak, saying, "You have to let me explain," saying, "The situation is more complicated than you think." Vittorio didn't raise his voice. He never raised his voice. He simply placed a laptop on the table, already connected to the hard drive, and pressed play. His father's voice filled the room, recorded 3 years earlier, and the second voice belonged to Vaughn. The recording lasted less than 2 minutes. In it, Vaughn told a third man that the girl was the only problem, that as long as she was still there, no one could touch the trust, and that he would pay once to have the matter finished. Vittorio stopped the recording. Vaughn said nothing more. Vittorio said, "My father recorded you 3 months before he died. He didn't know the name of the traitor, but he recorded every person who might have been the one. He just didn't live long enough to listen to it all again." Then Vittorio pushed another set of papers across the table. It was the bank's response. All 11 signatures in the transfer documents had been flagged as irregular. The file had been frozen, and under bank procedure, every transaction flowing from those documents was invalid until the beneficiary appeared for direct verification. Vittorio said, "You forced my wife to sign papers for more than 20 minutes in a room underground, and she ruined all 11 signatures right in front of you, and you never saw it." Vaughn stared at the papers for a very long time. He didn't say another word, because he was a lawyer, and he knew exactly where he stood. Emma said one thing to her husband without looking at Vaughn: "Don't kill anyone because of me." No one in the room moved. Tommy Ricci stood at the door, and he knew very well that in 18 years his boss had dealt with things far less serious than this in a very different way. Vittorio sat still for several seconds. Then he said, "All right." On Thursday morning, instead of Curtis Vaughn arriving at the federal office, Agent Ruth Kessler was invited to a cafe on Atwells Avenue. Vittorio placed the hard drive and a copy of the recording on the table in front of her. He told her that inside was the name of the man who had been selling his family to her for the past 2 years, along with evidence of an order to commit murder, and that his wife would testify. Kessler listened to the recording, removed the headphones, and asked him what he wanted. Vittorio said, "I want an agreement for the people who had nothing to do with this, and I want all the legitimate properties left alone, because every commercial lease and warehouse dock is clean, and my father spent 20 years making them clean." Kessler asked, "What about everything else?" Vittorio said, "Everything else, I'll shut down." She looked up. He said, "Not today, not in a month, but I'll shut it down, and you'll see it close." Curtis Vaughn was arrested Friday morning in his own office. He didn't resist, and he didn't say anything to anyone. The last person he saw before getting into the vehicle was Tommy Ricci, standing across the street with his hands in his pockets. Over the next 18 months, the Falcone family withdrew from 3 of its old lines of business, and Vittorio sat in his father's office, night after night, moving each piece one by one into legitimate operations. Some people left, some stayed. The Belandi family remained quiet, because in that world, when a man had just shown the entire city that he could drag the traitor out of his own house, no one wanted to be the next person to test him. Years later, people on Federal Hill still told the story, and they always stopped at the same part, that the most powerful man in Rhode Island had every possible way to deal with a 58-year-old man inside a closed room that day, and he used none of them, simply because his wife asked him one thing, and he was a man who kept his word. Emma met Vivian only once, in the lawyer's waiting room before the trial. She said, "I taught you everything I knew. You learned all of it except one thing. You never learned how to care for another human being." Vivian sat in silence for a long time. Then she said the sentence she had never spoken to anyone in 13 years. "He came to my diner every Tuesday for an entire year. He never knew my name." Emma looked at her and said, "I know what that feels like. 2 years. And you were the one who made me feel it." Vittorio stood at the door. He didn't avoid his own part in what had happened. He said, "I didn't know the name of the dishwasher in my wife's restaurant. That was my failure, and I'll carry it for the rest of my life. But it didn't give you the right to do any of this." Vivian Ashford and Carl Soa were convicted on charges of kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, identity theft, and criminal conspiracy, with Carl receiving 20 years for his direct role in the confinement. Dr. Alan Reese was found in Naples, Florida, and he told investigators everything in exchange for a lighter sentence, admitting how Carl had procured an unclaimed body from a private morgue in Warwick to stage the fiery crash on Route 6. Emma testified and told the court exactly what had happened. In the medical records submitted as evidence, there was one line that the Providence Press repeated many times, stating that the procedures performed on the defendant's face couldn't be reversed. Vivian would look into a mirror every morning for the rest of her life and see the face of the woman she had tried to erase. Rosa Nera was rebuilt on the exact same foundation. Vittorio arrived at the construction site every morning at 6 o'clock carrying a hammer, and it took his men a full week to get used to seeing the boss standing beside the workers, hammering boards into place. During the second week, he went looking for Ines Alvarez. He knocked on the door of her home in Olneyville and called her by her full name, first and last. He thanked her for the 730 hot plates she had left on the 5th step. She said, "I didn't do anything." He offered her the job of managing the new restaurant. She refused, laughed, and said, "I've been in kitchens for 36 years. I like my sink," he said. "Then you stay in the kitchen. Your pay doubles, and no one is allowed to change that." Beginning the following month, the staff name boards in all 11 Falcone family restaurants listed every employee's full first and last name. No one was just server or kitchen helper anymore. Emma went to the nursing home one Saturday afternoon. Teresa Marchetti didn't recognize her daughter. She asked who Emma was. Then 3 minutes later asked the same question again. Emma asked the kitchen if she could borrow a cutting board, sat beside her mother's bed, and began chopping onions. As she worked, she hummed an old song Teresa used to sing when Emma was little. Halfway through the song, Teresa turned her head and said, "Emma, you've been singing that note wrong since you were a child." Emma set down the knife. Mother and daughter sat together until dark. Rosa Nera reopened on a September evening, more than a year after that morning on Atwells Avenue. There was no large celebration, only the staff and a few longtime regulars. Before the doors opened, Vittorio handed his wife a new key. Even though the old cellar door no longer had any lock beyond a simple wooden latch, he said, "Yours." Emma held it in her hand, stood looking at the room downstairs, now transformed into an open wine room with warm lighting, then told her husband one thing: a promise is still a promise, even when no one hears it, especially when no one hears it. This story leaves us with a few things to think about. The most frightening prison isn't a room underground. It's when someone decides that you aren't worth being seen, and then the entire world passes by you every day without stopping for even a second. The dishwasher, whose name no one knew, saved an entire family, and she did it not because she understood what was happening, but simply because every night she left a hot meal on a stair for someone she didn't understand, didn't question, and still chose to treat with kindness. The smallest act of kindness, repeated faithfully and without needing anyone to know about it, can sometimes be the very thing that keeps another person alive. And in the end, it is quiet loyalty, not loud declarations, that truly holds a life together. If today's story touched you, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video so that each day we can continue listening together to more meaningful stories. How did this story make you feel? And in your own life, have you ever met someone people pass by every day without ever remembering their name? Or have you yourself ever gone through a time when you felt invisible like that? Please leave a few lines in the comments below. We truly want to hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. We wish every one of you watching this video abundant health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.